I think for the general public and maybe for your audience, it comes down to setting priorities. There's a certain limitation on how much free will we have, how much of our decisions is not dictated to us, but comes from us alone. And so when the chance makes to come to a decision, I would ask the audience, make sure that you make the decision in a way that will maximize what's important for you. For me, what's important is love, is joy, is meaning.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Reflections on Living Well podcast, where we explore perspectives on the good life in the 21st century. I am your host, Broderick Rodell. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Reflections on Living Well podcast. Today we have a special guest and Professor Stanley Krippner. Dr. Krippner is a pioneering humanistic psychologist and a true trailblazer in the realm of consciousness exploration, pushing boundaries by delving into cross-cultural perspectives and the intriguing realm of non-ordinary experiences that boldly challenge conventional paradigms. With an extensive body of work, he is an award-winning prolific author and esteemed researcher, diving into diverse subjects such as dreaming, psychedelics, creativity, shamanism, parapsychology, and trauma. His most recent work, A Chaotic Life, is more than a memoir. It is an invitation to witness the interaction of science, art, and spirituality through the eyes of someone who has lived at the forefront of consciousness studies. His extraordinary journey is a testament to the power of curiosity, resilience, and the enduring quest for knowledge. This compelling narrative not only celebrates the achievements of a remarkable individual, but also inspires readers to consider the vast paradoxes and promises of the human condition. Hi, Stan. How are you?
Hello there, Broderick. Hello there, Broderick. How nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. I'm very, very excited to have this conversation with you. By the way, audience, Stan is 91 years old and he's still have the clear mind, and it's amazing to witness your life experiences through the little bit that I've explored. Looking forward to reading your memoir. I haven't done that quite yet, but I'm excited to have this conversation and see what unfolds in it. So I like to, and even though I read that introduction, I like for guests to introduce themselves however you like. How do you like to introduce yourself?
Well, to introduce myself, I would simply say that I'm an ordinary human being who has found himself in the middle of some extraordinary circumstances, both historically and personal, and that I've done my best to learn from them and to help other people learn from them.
Awesome. Very humble. I would like to, I hope to unpack a little bit more of who you are throughout this conversation. I'm sure we're going to do that. But in the beginning, I'd like to ask, what is your perspective on living well or the good life? And then we'll unpack it for the rest of the conversation.
Well, as you said, I'm 91 years of age. So for me, the good life is getting through the day with a minimum of pain, a maximum of joy, and when I go to bed at night, I have no idea if I will get to sleep, no idea if I will have pain all night, and if I get enough sleep, that for me is a good life. having enough sleep and being free from pain at this point in my life. Now, having said that, I can't complain because I have been to parts of the world where people much younger than I am live in constant hunger and pain and misery. You ask them what does good life mean, they'd laugh in your face. So, despite my handicaps and challenges, I remain grateful that I've lived as long as I have and have had as many positive experiences as I have, and I'm still going through the day with as much joy and happiness as I can squeeze out and that other people can give me.
So that's awesome. I would like to explore a little bit more of that. So you've lived a long life. You've had quite a few experiences and your research and your studying. What else can you say about the good life or what it means to live well for the general public here? What is that? What does that look like? So to being happy right now and getting enough sleep and all that, those things for you at this stage of your life.
I think for the general public and maybe for your audience, it comes down to setting priorities. There's a certain limitation on how much free will we have, how much of our decisions is not dictated to us, but comes from us alone. And so in the trance phase, to come to a decision, I would ask the audience, make sure that you make the decision in a way that will maximize what's important for you. For me, what's important is love, is joy, is meaning. Maybe for some other people, the priority is much different. Well, figure out your priorities, and when you make a decision, ask yourself, is this part of my priority? Is this helping me live what I would consider a good life? And is this setting me up to have more of the good life in the future? We have to take consequence for our actions. And I said before, there's much in the world that is not in our control. I know people who have had their life snuffed out by accidents, by murder, by catastrophes. That's sad. There's a lot of what is going on that's not in our control. So I would tell your audience, focus on what is in your control and then craft your life carefully so that you maximize the opportunities that you have for meeting your priorities, whatever those priorities might be. As I said earlier, I try to give priority to love, to kindness, to friends and for service, and to make my decisions to maximize those particular priorities on my part. This is where, and again, your viewers might not be familiar with the term, my background in existential psychology is so important because existentialism focuses on finding meaning in whatever you do. Don't let life take you by surprise. Yes, go with the flow, but find a flow that is meaningful to you, that brings you happiness or joy or whatever your priorities may be. A lot of people walk blindly through life. This is the message, for example, of the philosopher Gurdjieff, and he said to people, wake up. And walking blindly through life, life will be over before you know it, and you will ask, where did everything go? Don't let that happen to you. Be awake, be aware, and be attentive. Pay attention to what's happening, and so you will have a more satisfactory life. Aldous Huxley is one of my favorite authors, and he wrote a wonderful novel called Island. And in Island, which is his version of Utopia, there were birds who constantly reminded people, attention, pay attention, be in the here and the now, watch what you were doing. And that was very essential to creating the society where there was a great deal of happiness.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. You said quite a few things there that is definitely very important. Is finding out what we value, what's important to us, what are our core values, paying attention to our life, finding meaning in our lives, and really maximizing our core values in our lives to the best of our ability, to make sure that we can live that good life, live a life well lived. And that requires work. It requires some work on ourselves, self-exploration, observation, attentiveness. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the Aldous Huxley's book Island, and I remember that from reading that book, The Birds. Attention now, attention.
Yeah.
Just consistently reminding us to pay attention. What's happening right now in the moment. That's beautiful. Can you share a little bit more of your life experiences that has helped you come to see the world this way? What were some of your influences that help you see things, to come to see things in this perspective?
Well, I had to read all of this when I wrote my book, A Chaotic Life, my memoir that you were kind enough to mention, which is available for your readers to read or purchase. And I think that major influences started when I was very, very young, because both my father and my mother had a major impact on my life, emphasizing hard work, emphasizing collegial relationships with family members, with neighbors, emphasizing happiness and joy. My father had a very successful orchard and farm, and despite the fact we never had very much money, he was very intent on taking us to different parts of the country, to different relatives, where to see interesting sights. As I look back on it, I'm really astonished at the number of places he took myself, my mother, my sister, so that we could have a wider knowledge of the world. My first out of the country travel was to Canada, when he took us to see Niagara Falls from the Canadian point of view. And also, my mother, for some reason or another, got me scrapbooks. And everything that I did went into the scrapbooks. I had a ton of scrapbooks, and I was able to pull on all of that information when I wrote my memoirs. I have no idea why my mother was that intent to have me record everything, but it certainly paid off. So another influence was my work at the University of Wisconsin as an undergraduate. That really shaped my life, because I was enrolled in the Integrated Liberal Studies program, which put me in touch with classical literature, the foundations of science, the foundations of, for example, economics. It was a wonderful liberal education, sad to say, that very few people are getting nowadays. Mm-hmm. And I pull upon that background all of the time in terms of references and in terms of my own personal orientation. I also, as part of that program, took a course in general semantics, which emphasized the meaning that words have on our behavior. And this is something that I continually focus on, asking people to define what they mean, not to let a word slip by without making sure your audience knows and appreciates what you're talking about. Effective communication has been another one of my influences. So I would say that being in Wisconsin also is an influence on my behavior, not only at the university, but the contact that I had with outstanding people in Wisconsin, notably the architect Frank Lloyd Wright, who I met a couple of times and who had an interesting influence on my life. I invited him to speak to the student body when I was at the University of Wisconsin in charge of the Speakers Bureau. And at dinner, he was asking people what they planned to do when they graduated. And one student said, well, it depends. I'm afraid that I'll be drafted and sent off to fight overseas in Korea or some distant part of the world. And Florence tried to say, well, don't go. What do you mean don't go? Go to jail, go to Canada, be a Canadian citizen, become a conscious objector, but you always have a choice. Well, that galvanized me. And years later, I found myself making the same statement to students I knew who were objecting to being drafted and sent off to that horrendous and useless war in Vietnam. And I actually was able to save a dozen students from the draft by telling them, when you go to the draft board, you can tell them that you're gay, you can tell them that you're psychotic, you can tell them you're a drug addict, and I will write a letter backing you up. That was dangerous for me because I was doing this on hospital stationery. I could have been fired, but I got a dozen people out of the draft, and maybe some of them would have been sent off to die in Vietnam. And so that's just one example of how my early years of Wisconsin have impacted my life early on. Good heavens, there's so many examples. When my mother and father took me traveling, one of the places we visited was to see relatives in the deep south, and we passed a cotton field where black people were picking cotton, and my mother gave me a bag of candy and said, go and give some candy to those workers. I have a photograph that's very meaningful for me, giving candy to the workers. That was my very first contact with people of color. And it wasn't the last because there were neighbors of ours who moved into a farm, wonderful black family, and the mother of the family tried to get membership in the Ladies' Society. My mother backed her up. She was voted down. That was a big shock, my first contact with racism. And as time went on, and again, I don't want to go off on too many tangents, but when I was working in Richmond, Virginia, with students having special needs in the days that racial segregation was very intense, and the governor of Virginia was saying the Deep South says never. And without any publicity, we integrated this very clinic, and we have black therapists working with white kids and white therapists working with black kids. Nobody made any objection because we kept it out of public view. Mm-hmm. So you talked about early influences. Yes, those are a few of them.
Wow, amazing. Yeah, I think even just in the beginning, your parents, your father, making sure that you get exposed to the world, to get exposed to different things. I think that's so important for young people to get
very
exposed.
Important. When I was very young, I was very introverted. I was happy just staying in my room reading books. And my father and mother pushed me to join Boy Scouts, country, the 4-H club, other social organizations. And they said, you have to learn how to be with people. And they really pushed me to join all of these social organizations. And so that's another great debt that I owe them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so critical, to have parents, to have guardians, to really encourage young people and to push them to challenge themselves, to expand their horizons to some capacity. Because you're right, it definitely enhances their understanding of the world later on in life. You said something else I also think is so critical that we tend to forget. And I agree with you on this, is that the lack of liberal education or liberal arts education that you had. Can you say a little bit more why you did say something about it, but why the liberal arts type of education is so critical? And can you say a little bit more about why do you think we're not doing it as much right now? What's happening with that?
Well, there's too much of an emphasis on seeing university education as a trade school.
Yep.
Getting people prepared for a career in business or science or the arts or whatever. Very, very narrow focused education instead of the broad education that I was fortunate enough to receive. It's a matter of economics and practicality, and that has never been one of my priorities, for better or for worse. I have friends who are geared toward making a lot of money. Fine, that's their priority. Other friends who are intent on becoming famous, that's their priority. Not mine, but that's their priority. The musical Evita had a wonderful line in it. Not for fortune, not for fame, I never invited them in. Good heavens. When I heard that on the Broadway stage, I said, well, that's the story of my life. For better or for worse, I've never tried to make money. I've never tried to be famous. And I've had other priorities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can you say a little bit more about that liberal education, liberal arts education? Can you say why that is so important? That broad education that you had.
I think that, for example, I could give so many examples. One of the books we read was by the Roman philosopher Croesus, De Rerum Natura, the meaning of the universe. This is such an important book because he was the first major philosopher who explained how the world works without resorting to gods and goddesses. Instead, talking about the work of atoms and how atoms make up everything in the universe. And he also attributed consciousness to everything, even atoms. And he used the term in English, swerve. An atom can swerve, can actually make its own move. And his emphasis on meaning And free will was way, way ahead of its time. And that influenced me because I've never had to resort to, shall we say, supernatural forces to explain things. We can get enough explanation just by studying the way that people are, the way that nature is, and chart our own course as a result of that. Now, having said that, my worldview is similar to Lucretius. There is meaning in everything, even atoms. There is a, shall we say, what Paul Tillich, the theologian, said, a ground of being. You call it God if you want, you call it nature you want, but it's a ground of being that everything arises from. And what is that ground of being? It's connection. It is love. And that is the driving force of evolution and of the way that the world works. If you lose contact with that connection, you are in bad shape. If you lose connection with the very nature that you're embedded in, pay the penalty for it. So this is just one of the examples. Also, we had a wonderful biology course way ahead of its time, emphasizing the environment and how humans are extracting a heavy price on the environment. And so ecology came from my work at the University of Wisconsin. Also, my father, who was incorporating organic farming into his work. And now, of course, we're faced with an ecological crisis. And I'm a member of several organizations trying to help out a little bit. Who knows, it might be too little, too late. But again, my contact with indigenous people around the world, especially Native Americans, noted that they were very protective in the environment. They said, a famous Native American saying, consider how your actions are going to affect future generations and the world that you live in. And again, I'm not whitewashing indigenous people because they made plenty of mistakes, they had plenty of superstitions, but by and large, they were very, very intent on protecting nature rather than exploiting nature.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Getting exposed to those types of ideas, those different worldviews, like Lucretius, and all of your travels, of course, and the Native American traditions. I think looking through the world through different lenses, looking at the world through different worldviews or perspectives, it's a lot of what I'm trying to do here with this podcast, as well as interview people from different walks of life, different experiences, and sharing their take on what the good life is or what living well is. At least I'm just tailoring the conversation in that direction. But what I'm really trying to do is encourage us to be reflective about our own lives, but also seeing how different people see things. And I think the liberal arts education, a little that I know about it, can do that for people, particularly classic literature, of course, and getting a broad perspective of how we see things about the world. I just think it opens us up to possibilities that we don't generally get in our education. I always tell people I have a PhD in chemical engineering, so I have a doctorate of philosophy in chemical engineering, and I never took a philosophy course. With 10 years of education, and never took a course on ethics, never took didn't know much about philosophy at all, outside of the applied sciences that I was engaged in. And so I just think that's I want to be careful with my words here. I think it was a disservice to my education. I think a lot of the issues and problems that we see in the world with technology production is that people don't know. How, they're not aware. They never got exposed to different kinds of ideas, and so they've been educated. We've been educated to focus on one particular subject, like you said earlier, and we never really had or been challenged really a little bit. But not really challenged to expand our awareness and think outside of the box and to try to understand how we've gotten to see the world the way we do, what has historically put us here. And I think that liberal arts education on getting a broad perspective is really important. And I hope that, I don't know, but I hope that becomes, that people see the value in that, and there's what's the word I'm looking for? We're starting to reclaim a liberal arts education again. Yeah.
Well, I think you have done a good job of catching up, Broderick, despite your lack of philosophy in your PhD work. Fortunately, I had several courses in philosophy at the University of Wisconsin, and that's where I learned about ethics, about values, about morality, and also from a number of different perspectives, because nobody actually told us what to do. Mm-hmm. They encouraged us to think for ourselves. One of the influences on my life was the philosopher Alan Watts, who I became good friends with. And he introduced me to Eastern thought, Eastern philosophy. And he never told anybody what to do. He simply described the world as he saw it, and if it was of value to people, fine. And now, years after his passing, his books, his tapes are still selling. They're still meaningful to many, many people.
Yeah, me. I'm one of those people who really adores Alan Watts, especially his speech. I just love his speeches when he's just right off the just right off the cuff speaking. It's just so eloquent in the way that he spoke, and the way he can grab your attention and make you think. Like you say, it wasn't about, hey, do this. It was just like, hey, look at how about this? How can you see the world this way? How does that influence you? I think, he's had a major impact and continues to have an impact on the lives of lots of people.
Well, Alan Watts made so many impacts on me. I can remember his lecture on the circle of sex, 12 sexual varieties. And he had a figure for each one of the circles, like Sappho, the famous Greek poet, for one thing, Julius Caesar, who was every general's husband, every general's wife, every wife's husband. And he said, there are no weeds in the garden of sexuality, there's only flowers. Good heavens. And that was in the days when I grew up a massive homophobia and narrow-mindedness, and Alan Watts really set things in a different context for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. Again, exposure, folks, how important it is to expose our minds to ideas and to people who can open our minds to ideas, not telling us what to do, but open us to possibilities and going out and learning. So I guess that's another question here, or just for you to reflect on. You've already mentioned it, but can you say a little bit more about learning and the importance of learning, the value of learning, and making a good life?
I think that learning has to encourage independent thinking if it to be really learning in depth, where people are not simply force-fed a panoply of knowledge that engage in finding out things for themselves. Again, one of the influences on my life was the psychologist Carl Rogers. And he wrote a wonderful book about education that emphasized what he called person-centered education, where people would ultimately educate themselves, and their teacher would be more of a guide rather than a dictator. And it's this type of learning that has always been of appeal to me, and which I hope I've been able to impart to some of my students.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about thinking outside of the box. I think that's all very well and good, but I think that people need to learn inside the box first. Once they're grounded inside the box, then they can go outside of the box.
Yes.
Otherwise, you go off on tangents that don't know what they're talking about. Yeah, they have to have a solid grounding in whatever discipline they're studying, and then they can innovate once they have that solid grounding.
Yes. Yes, thank you for that clarification, because I think some people, yeah, this all over everywhere and scattered and not centered in anything. You have to be centered in something, grounded in something, and then from that grounded place, explore, extend yourself, but yet while grounded. You're right. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
Talking about virtue, one of the virtues that I think is so important is acceptance. Again, an influence on my life was Albert Ellis, another psychologist and psychotherapist. And when people came to him for psychotherapy, he emphasized, first of all, you have to accept yourself. You might not like much of what you're doing, but you have to accept it. That's your reality. Secondly, you have to accept others, even the people who are doing harm. Yes, they're doing something that is hurting you, but accept it. Realize that's the way it is, and then go on from there. And then you have to accept the world. You might not like the world, but you have to accept it before you can start to make changes on behalf of peace, on behalf of the environment, etc. And once again, it's a matter of grounding. Once you're grounding in accepting what's actually going on, then you can start to intervene and make what changes you're able to make yourself and your relationship and your worldview.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. I think sometimes we can get confused when we say when someone says acceptance. Acceptance doesn't mean that we want things to always remain as it is. No, it's just meant see the world and see yourself as you are right now. Because if we're not honest with how things really are in this moment, how are we gonna actually change it? How are we gonna have an impact? How are we gonna move forward if we're not accepting of the way things really are in the moment? Because if we're deluded by an idea of what things really are, we're just caught in abstraction. We're not seeing things as they are. We're seeing a narrative that we have about it. And it's very hard to do anything about a situation. You're not going to be able to do anything effectively or efficiently.
Absolutely. Acceptance does not mean approval.
Yeah.
Again, I come back to the word grounding. One has to be grounded and be quite aware of the way things work, back to Lucretius, De Rerum Natura, the nature of the universe. Once you are grounded in the way things work, the way things are, then you can make what interventions you prefer to make and try to make.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah. So earlier you, speaking of values and I guess virtues, I think it's a virtue. You said that your important value or virtue is love. And you talked about also your worldview and how your worldview has shaped your value, this value or this virtue of love for you. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Again, it goes into my classical education. I think it is Victor Hugo who wrote in one of his novels, "Let everything you do come out of love." That's a wonderful model for me. I think this is the basic nature of the universe. We live in a universe of connectivity. Connectivity is what enables evolution to take place. It's what holds things together. And in human terms, this becomes what we might call love. As further as we depart from love, from that connection, that is where mischief at the least, evil at the worst, comes into the picture, because we're apart from our basic nature.
Mm-hmm. I remember one of those lectures that Alan Watts gave, and I think that one, the language that he used really stuck with me, and I use it to this day, was the problem is when we make distinctions, when we separate ourselves from nature, from everything else, we disconnect ourselves from this web that we're connected in. And you're right. I agree. I at least agree with you that, yeah, it leads to all kinds of violence and harm and problems that we see in the world because we fail to see our interdependence, our connection, because we're so fixated on distinction and our separateness. Yeah.
Yes, Alan Watts was an early advocate of ecology, and there's decades ago that I knew Alan Watts, back in the 1960s, 1970s, and he died an early death, too much alcohol, sad to say, but nobody's perfect. But he said, nobody will remember me 50 years from now, and he was dead wrong. He's been gone for more than 50 years, and his books and his tapes and his writings are still making an impact on people. And as I say, much of what he was doing to foster a connection with the environment was way ahead of its time. And now the ecology movement, again, is trying to do a bit of catch up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You just mentioned something that I think I would love to hear your thoughts on. And like Alan Watts, who's the little that I know, you knew him personally, just a very wise and intelligent human being, and seemed like he was really concerned with human well-being and goodness, these higher virtues. Yeah, he still had an alcohol problem. Can you talk about how you can still live a good life or have a meaningful life, and you still have problems, you still have issues? Isn't, can you say something about that? And can you have, I guess the question is, can you have a meaningful good life and still have challenges and issues that you're dealing with?
I think these challenges and issues are very much of a challenge to living a good life. And I have my own challenges and issues. Now that I'm 91 years of age, I have multiple health problems, of course. But over the years, I've also had very serious problems, family problems, financial problems, relationship problems, etc. And I try not to let those bog me down. I have seen friends who get so bogged down in a relationship issue, a financial issue, a status issue, it takes over their life.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes over their life They don't have any time for happiness, for joy, or for having something pleasant to enjoy during the day. For me, one of the most important virtues is joy. And joy does not come automatically. You have to program yourself to find joy. And then once you have found joy, maintain it and bring it back whenever you can. Joy and awe and surprise, those are all important parts of the human condition that we can't take for granted. We have to make a conscious effort to bring those into our life.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. The reason why I asked you that question is I sometimes I think we can delude ourselves to think that a good life or living well is perfect. Oh, I have no problems. No, that's not what it is. And I think you just eloquently spoke to the process. I think of it as a process. Is that you're going to have challenges in life, and I don't think you can escape it. You might have a shadow that you're working through for your whole life, but the good life or living well is about contending with that, trying to work through that, learning something about yourself, and then taking the time and putting the energy, the effort into cultivating our capacity to experience those positive values like joy. It's not just going to come. You can have joyful moments. There are things that are unexpected in our lives. That's true, absolutely. But we have to put some energy, some effort into it. So living a good life is not just sitting back and resting on our laurels or just sitting back and waiting for things to happen. No, it's being active. You have to actively pursue those positive qualities. You have to actively work through those challenges that we're having in our lives. I mean, at least that's what I took from what you just said.
Well, I think you put it very, very well. And this is why I sometimes lose patience with people who have very naive worldviews. They say, well, God never gives us anything that we cannot ultimately cope with. Good heavens, that's rubbish. What kind of a God would do something like that? Or I remember when a noted friend of mine died at early death, and they're all said, well, his work was done. What he was on the earth to do was finished. Oh, ridiculous. I don't think that people are put on earth to do one thing or another. I think that, again, that's superstition. Here we are, and we have to take some responsibility for our own destiny and those around us. And again, I think there are too many religions who have a very stereotyped point of view of how things work and what people are here to do. People are not here to do any one thing. People decide themselves what to do. They're not passive recipients of some divine plan. They're in charge. This is my existential background that comes first. With what little free will we have, we create our own plan, our own universes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's you keep reminding us too that we have choice. We may not have 100% free will. We may not, we can't just do whatever we want to do, but we do have choice. And what little choice that we do have, those choices that we take or make, they shape and mold our lives. And that's why it's important, again, to really educate ourselves, to live a life of learning so we can make wise choices to the best of our ability to facilitate a good life, a life well lived.
Oh, because you give me a good example, Broderick. my background in existential psychology, humanistic psychology, transpersonal psychology, put me in touch with a lot of interesting and important people, one of whom is Anthony Suzik. And he spent most of his life in an incubator because he could barely breathe. And as time went on, he lost his power of speech. He would only use his fingers to type out information with his wife's help, thank heavens. She stood by him. And he founded the Journal of Humanistic Psychology, the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology. Whenever there were conventions, there he was in his incubator, and people would come up and greet him. He could not speak, but he would recognize them. And he accomplished so much with a minimum of free will, couple of fingers, and a typewriter. It's just astounding what he did and how he changed the field of psychology. He was one of my early students at the Humanistic Psychology Institute, and with his two fingers, he wrote the history of transpersonal psychology. And when he went down for his oral examination, there he was in his incubator, there his wife was. Obviously, he couldn't say too much, but we told him that his dissertation was outstanding and he would finally have his PhD. Excellent. That night, I went to bed and I had a dream, and there's Anthony Suzik walking toward me. I said, Tony, how can you walk? You're in an incubator. Well, I'm dead now, and so I can walk. Well, that was the very night that he actually died. Yeah, so that connection, very meaningful to me, and it really had quite a stunning ending. And of course, I'm of the persuasion that people do survive bodily death. I'm of the persuasion that life is ongoing, and the form that it takes is sometimes unpredictable. But again, one of the main emphases on transpersonal psychology is to interview people who have had what is called near-death experiences, where they're clinically dead and they go into some other dimension and come back and talk about it. What they talk about is not really what most of the religions of the world tell them is happening in the afterlife. It's something much more pleasant, much less doctrinaire. But this is one of the fields of research that I think is so important. It's finally gaining a little bit of credibility. The American Psychological Association just published a book by a friend of mine, Death is an Altered State of Consciousness, talking about all of the evidence that there is for post-mortem survival. Quite a breakthrough that this topic is now being discussed intelligently to the extent that I've never seen it discussed before in psychology.
That's amazing. I'm happy to hear that. I think it takes times for paradigms to shift, right?
Oh, yeah.
It takes times. I think there is this old saying that the old generation of the old paradigm needs to die off, and then the new generation, then they can finally encourage and push the things that you've been pushing and encouraging for many years now. You've been talking about these things. You've done tons of research, and I'm happy that you're living to see that it's starting to take root in the mainstream.
Well, yes, one of the happy results of living so long, I've been able to see psychedelic research and psychedelic therapy finally taking off. This is something I've been advocating since the early 1960s. Having had experiences with LSD and other psychedelics myself, and seeing how they fell into misuse. My dear friend Timothy Leary was partially responsible for that, saying that people should have massive use of psychedelics, very different than Alan Watts, who would limit psychedelics to carefully supervised guidance sessions. And the Alan Watts paradigm finally has caught on. Took decades, and finally now we are having excellent results on psychedelic therapy, especially for depression, and ayahuasca therapy, which comes from a vine that I investigated personally in South America, that is also producing therapeutic breakthroughs. And this is something very few people would have suspected 50 years ago. And as I say, I'm happy I lived to see this finally coming true.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. I think that, it's definitely happening. People are having a much more positive view, understanding of psychedelics and therapy and how the importance and value of psychedelics and helping people heal. And also helping people awaken to different possibilities and opening themselves up to different possibilities and allowing those experiences to guide them in some capacity, to help them see things, to see that the world doesn't have to be the way that it is. It can be different. My life can be different than what it is. How do I mitigate unnecessary suffering in my life? Because I've been opened up to a different set of possibilities, and I'm happy to see it as well. But I was indoctrinated, most of my life. I was, like, no, you don't do that stuff. Was it Dare and all of these various campaigns in the 80s and 90s? But even prior to that, of course, after Timothy Leary's encouragement in the 60s, 70s. But it's really good to see that that's shifting and that's changing. I think we're seeing a change in the culture, and there's a lot more that needs to happen culturally, of course. And I think a lot of the things that you mentioned today, and one of the reasons why I wanted you to elaborate a little bit on a liberal education, a liberal arts education, to make sure people understand that reading classics, trying to have a better understanding of how we've gotten here, having a broad education is useful for helping us have a much more open mind to what's possible and to open us up to exploring different possibilities and not getting caught up into dogma and being limited by certain.
Oh, you're so right. Again, one of the benefits of my liberal arts education was my early grounding in science. And to this day, I view everything through the lens of psychological science. And I don't resort to more esoteric explanations. I think that science has its limitations. It can be wrong, it can be mistaken, but it's self-correcting. An example of that, if I can diverge just a moment, I've had an early interest in marijuana, and the leading scientific experts 56 years ago were calling it a gateway drug that would lead to heroin, etc., etc. People were sent to jail for smoking marijuana, etc. I read the evidence. No, the evidence was very clear. It had minimal negative effects. No, it's not completely innocent. It had minimal negative effects, especially in comparison with alcohol and tobacco. And I was an early advocate of the legalization of marijuana. I actually published an article back in the early 1970s commenting on the way that illegal drugs were being used by Vietnam soldiers who had come back with a history of illegal drugs. And I wrote, well, someday the Vietnam War will be over. Someday marijuana will be legalized. I was right. Took longer for marijuana to be legalized than for that Vietnam War to be closed. But now we find that there are actually some health benefits to marijuana. Well, those are evidence 70 to 80 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're finally catching up with the science.
Yeah. I love it. I love it. Thank you for sharing all of that. I think that, in sharing, elaborating on the fact that having a liberal arts education, an education where you're exploring classical ideas, and not just classical, exploring different kinds of ideas and perspective, it's not anti-science. You can still engage and have a scientific worldview and explore ideas. And I think it's important. Science is definitely not perfect, but having that scientific mindset, that mindset of experimentation, observation, exploration, testing, that's just making predictions based on those theories and ideas, and being open to change. I think that's an important facet of being a human being, is that having that scientific mindset. The unfortunate thing is a lot of scientists do not have that scientific mindset. They become religious fundamentalists in science, and they're using science in a way that is very dogmatic and fundamentalistic, and not open, not looking at the research, not willing to change. So I'm glad that you brought that up, because sometimes when we talk about liberal arts types of ideas, philosophy, ethics, and things of that nature, some people may think that, you have to dispense with science. No, you don't have to dispense with science at all. It's all a part of it. And that's just having that in very inclusive way of looking at things, an integrated way of looking at things.
Oh, you're so right. Also, some of the dogmas in science have been oppressive not only to ethnic minorities, religious minorities, and sexual minorities, but to women. Mm-hmm. And I was an early advocate for women's rights. This actually goes back to my college days, where I would bring women into decision-making capacities. And as time went on, made sure that whenever there was a committee or a program, I would bring qualified women into the picture. And again, I had to wait for a while, but finally, thanks to women's liberation, et cetera, and feminism, et cetera, finally, it's wonderful to see women taking their place. There are now more female graduate students in psychology than men. I think that's just great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's great as well. This has been lovely. We're coming to a close now. I can listen. I can sit at your feet and listen to you speak and hear about and share your stories forever, not forever, for quite a long time. And I really appreciate a lot of the things that you've shared here today. Are there any final words that you have? Any things that you would like to share with the audience? Well, actually, before you ask that question, I want to ask you this question. Would you say that you've lived a life well lived so thus far?
I wouldn't say I've lived a life well lived. No, I would say I've lived an interesting life. Mm-hmm. But I would not say it's well lived, because I made so many, many mistakes. And when I wrote my memoir, A Chaotic Life, it became even more apparent to me. Obviously, I can't go back and live my life over, but I really am upset when people say, oh, if I had your life to live over, I'd do it the exact way. Oh, God, my God, I would never do it this exact way. All the mistakes I've made. So I would not say that I've lived a life well lived. I would say I've lived a life fully lived, and an interesting life, and leave it at that. Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of my advice to your listeners, again, I go back to Aldous Huxley, and when he was asked what his legacy was, what his final advice was to people, he said, I would urge people to be kinder to each other. I could not come up with anything better. If people are kinder to each other, that can help to bridge some of the gaps we see today, the political divide in the United States, the wars in the Middle East, etc. This is division. This is alienation. This is not love. This is not kindness. And again, goes back to acceptance. You don't have to approve of what people are doing, but you can accept what they're doing, manifest some kindness, and go on from there to help people live their life in a way that they find more joyous and more fulfilling.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Stan. This has been a joy for me to be with you. I have a lot of admiration for you and your work. I'm really looking forward to reading The Chaotic Life. Audience, please go out and check it out. It's in 3 volumes.
Yes, but I urge people to get the Kindle version instead, because that has chapters that the 3 volumes left out.
Good.
And it's less expensive to get the Kindle version.
Got you. I asked the question: will it ever become an audiobook? Because
I would love it to become an audiobook. That's out of my hands.
Okay.
But so many people who have problems reading because of visual challenges really don't on audiobooks, which I think is absolutely great. And of course, if this were to be an audiobook, I would not want it to be 3 volumes long.
No.
I would want it to be much more condensed, but we'll see what happens in the future.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Again, this has been lovely. And audience, I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have. It's a privilege and an honor. And I'll say one more thing to it. It's for me, it's really important to have the elders share their wisdom, their life experience. And this has been a blessing to have you share your life experience in this brief time. It's only been an hour, and I'm definitely grateful, and I hope the audience is grateful for the life that you've lived and the things that you've done to try to make our world better and to open our minds to better possibilities. So thank you for that.
Thank you for asking such intelligent questions. I do a lot of podcasts, but I like your podcast because you really focused on meaningful questions and penetrating questions that are to the benefit of whoever listens or watches your podcast.
Well, thank you. Good to have this talk, and looking forward to connecting with you again offline. All right.
Okay, thank you, Broderick. Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning into the show. I hope this conversation has inspired you to reflect on your own views of the good life. If you enjoyed the show and want to hear more inspiring and thought-provoking conversations, please follow, write a review, and rate us on your favorite podcast app. If you are tuning in on YouTube, please hit that like button and subscribe. Your support is very much appreciated.